December 1944. A German interrogation post somewhere behind the lines in the Ardennes. A lieutenant named Hans Brandt sat across a wooden table from a stack of captured documents and tried, for the third time that week, to understand something that had nothing to do with tactics, troop strength, or unit identification. The documents were letters. American soldiers' mail, recovered from a column ambushed 2 days earlier, taken because German intelligence doctrine required that all captured paper be screened for useful information, unit designations, troop movements, morale indicators, anything that might tell you something about the men on the other side of the line. Most of what Brandt found was exactly what he expected: complaints about the cold, requests for socks, a sergeant asking his wife to send cigarettes. Routine, human, unremarkable. But there was a pattern underneath the routine that Brandt could not stop noticing, and it bothered him more than any tactical detail could have. The Americans he was reading about, men whose units had taken brutal casualties in the fighting around Saint-Vite, men who, by every account, should have been approaching the breaking point, wrote home in a tone Brandt did not recognize from any German soldier's letters he had ever screened. They were tired. Some were frightened, openly, in writing, without shame. But they were not broken. And running through nearly every letter, regardless of unit, regardless of how bad the fighting had been, was the same recurring detail: a reference to mail. Got your letter from the 12th. Read it 4 times. Tell Mom I'm fine. Send more when you can. Mail call is the only good part of the day. Brandt set the letters down and made a note in his report that his superiors would later find almost embarrassing in its candor. He wrote that the American Army appeared to have built some kind of systematic morale apparatus connected to mail delivery, and that its psychological effect on frontline troops seemed to exceed anything achieved by German propaganda directed at German soldiers. He was not wrong. He had simply stumbled, without realizing it, onto one of the most quietly sophisticated logistics operations the United States built during the entire war. Hold that thought. Because what Hans Brandt was reading in those captured letters was not sentiment. It was infrastructure. And to understand why it worked, you need to understand a decision the American military made in 1941, before a single American soldier had fired a shot. The decision that loneliness was a logistics problem, and logistics problems could be solved. The United States Army in 1941 had a name for the thing that destroys soldiers faster than bullets. They did not call it fear. Fear, the planners understood, could be trained around. They called it isolation, the slow psychological erosion that happens to a man cut off from everything that made him a person before the Army issued him a rifle and a serial number. Every army in history had understood, in some basic way, that morale mattered. What almost no army had done was treat morale the way the United States treated ammunition or fuel, as a quantifiable resource that could be measured, produced, and delivered on schedule, at scale, to millions of men spread across every theater of a global war. This required solving 2 separate but related problems. The first was entertainment and human contact, getting American culture, American voices, American faces to men stationed in places so remote that some of them would not see another woman for 2 years. The second was mail, getting actual letters, actual handwriting, actual proof that someone back home was still thinking about you, across an ocean and a battlefield, to a soldier who might be anywhere on any given day. The first problem produced the United Service Organizations, the USO, founded in February 1941, 10 months before Pearl Harbor, by an act of deliberate foresight that assumed America would eventually be drawn into the war and decided to prepare the morale infrastructure in advance. The second problem produced V-mail, a system so elegant in its solution to an impossible logistics constraint that it deserves to be remembered as one of the genuine engineering achievements of the war, even though it involved no machinery more complicated than a camera and a roll of film. Let's start with the mail, because the mail is where the real story lives. By 1942, the United States Army had a problem that sounds almost absurd, stated plainly. It was running out of room to carry letters. The scale of American mobilization was staggering, and every mobilized man wrote home, and every family back home wrote back. By mid-war, the volume of mail moving between the United States and overseas theaters had reached approximately 38 million pieces per month. Each one of those letters was paper. Paper has weight. Weight on a cargo ship or a transport aircraft already straining under fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies is the most contested resource in military logistics. Every ton of mail was a ton of something else that didn't make the trip. Every cargo plane loaded with letters was a cargo plane not loaded with plasma or ammunition. The War Department understood, correctly, that morale was essential to combat effectiveness, but it could not simply prioritize sentiment over the material the Army needed to survive. So in June 1942, the Army adopted a British innovation developed by Kodak engineer Maurice Pulvermacher for the Royal Air Force and re-engineered it at industrial scale. V-mail, victory mail. The system worked like this. A soldier or a family member back home wrote a letter, not on regular stationery, but on a standardized form, roughly the size of a single sheet of paper, with the message written in the space provided. The completed form was sent to a regional V-mail station, where it was photographed onto 16mm microfilm alongside thousands of other letters in a single continuous reel. The film reel, weighing a fraction of an ounce, capable of holding the equivalent of 1,600 individual letters, was then transported overseas by air, occupying a sliver of the cargo space that the original paper letters would have required. At the receiving end, the film was developed and the letters were printed back out, reduced in size, roughly 4 by 5 inches, but completely legible, and delivered to the soldier exactly as his family had written them. The numbers tell the story better than any description. A mail bag that would normally require 37 cargo planes to transport, full of paper letters, could be carried by a single aircraft once converted to V-mail. By the time the system reached full operational scale, V-mail processing facilities were converting roughly 150,000 letters per day onto film, and the United States Postal Service estimated the program saved enough cargo space across the war to be equivalent to thousands of additional cargo flights that instead carried fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies to the men those very letters were addressed to. This is the detail worth sitting with. The system that delivered emotional connection to soldiers was engineered with the same rigor, the same obsession with efficiency, the same industrial logic as the systems that delivered bullets and blood plasma. The United States Army had concluded, as a matter of doctrine, that a letter from home was not a luxury competing with the war effort for resources. It was part of the war effort. It went in the same category, conceptually, as ammunition and rations, something that kept a soldier functional, and therefore something that deserved engineering attention, budget, and priority. No other army in the war built anything resembling this. The German Feldpost system, the Wehrmacht's military postal service, was competent and, in the war's early years, reasonably reliable. But it operated on a model that treated mail as logistics overhead. Necessary, tolerated, never prioritized, never engineered to scale alongside the war's growing demands. By 1944, as Germany's transport network collapsed under Allied bombing and the loss of fuel reserves, Feldpost delivery to the Eastern and Western fronts became erratic, then sporadic, then, in many sectors, non-existent for weeks at a time. German soldiers in the last years of the war frequently went months without word from home and had no system, no Kodak engineer, no industrial alternative standing ready to solve the problem, because the problem had never been defined as one worth solving at that level. The second half of this story, the half that explains why Hans Brandt found American soldiers psychologically intact under conditions that should have broken them, is the United Service Organizations. The USO was not a military unit. It was a private, non-profit, chartered by Franklin Roosevelt's administration, but staffed and funded largely through civilian donation, combining 6 existing service organizations: the YMCA, the YWCA, the Salvation Army, the National Catholic Community Service, the National Travelers Aid Association, and the Jewish Welfare Board, into a single, coordinated body whose mission was deceptively simple: bring a piece of home to wherever American servicemen were stationed. In practice, this meant clubs. By 1944, the USO operated more than 3,000 locations worldwide, in cities, in remote Pacific Island bases, in transit camps, anywhere American troops gathered in numbers large enough to justify a presence. These were not glamorous facilities. Most were converted buildings: a church basement, a requisitioned hotel, a Quonset hut on a coral atoll, staffed by volunteers, mostly women, who served coffee, organized dances, wrote letters for soldiers who couldn't write themselves, and simply listened. The famous element, the USO show, the celebrity performances, Bob Hope's Christmas tours that would eventually become legendary, was the visible tip of an operation whose real substance was unglamorous and constant. For every Bob Hope show performed for thousands of cheering troops at a forward airbase, there were 10,000 evenings at a local USO club where a homesick 19-year-old simply sat and talked to a volunteer who reminded him for an hour of his mother, his sister, the diner back home. The doctrine behind this, and it was doctrine, debated and funded at the highest levels of military and civilian planning, was that a soldier's psychological endurance was not a fixed personal trait. It was a resource that depleted under stress and could be replenished, the same way a body depletes calories and needs to be refed. The American military, drawing on emerging psychiatric research from the First World War about what was then called shell shock, had concluded that combat exhaustion was not a character failure, it was attrition. And attrition could be slowed, managed, and partially reversed if a soldier had periodic access to something that reconnected him, even briefly, to a version of life that wasn't war. The Germans had no equivalent doctrine, and this was not an oversight. It was philosophical. German military culture, shaped by a tradition stretching back through Prussian military education, treated psychological resilience as a function of character, discipline, and ideological conviction, something instilled through training and reinforced through unit cohesion and belief in the cause, not something requiring external infrastructure to sustain. The idea of a private, non-profit organization, funded by civilian donations, dedicated entirely to managing soldiers' emotional well-being through coffee, dances, and conversation, would have struck most German officers as faintly absurd. a misallocation of resources toward a problem that a properly disciplined soldier should not have. This was not a moral failing on the part of individual German soldiers. It was a doctrinal blind spot at the level of the entire military culture, the same blind spot, in a different uniform, that led German medical doctrine to treat battlefield wounds as inevitable damage to be managed, rather than injuries to be aggressively prevented and treated. A pattern repeats across every comparison this channel has made between these two militaries. The Americans kept finding problems that German doctrine considered unsolvable, and building systems to solve them anyway, because American military culture did not treat the human cost of war as something to simply be endured. The place where this distinction became starkest, where the gap between American morale logistics and German morale doctrine produced a measurable, recorded difference in fighting capacity, was the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, in the worst winter weather Western Europe had seen in decades, American soldiers in the Ardennes were fighting under conditions that, by any standard military psychology model of the era, should have produced catastrophic rates of combat exhaustion and breakdown. Trench foot, frostbite, sleep deprivation measured in days rather than hours, artillery barrages that lasted without pause, the psychological shock of being surrounded and cut off from supply in several sectors. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne was encircled, undersupplied, and fighting in temperatures that dropped below 0 Fahrenheit at night. Army psychiatric reports from the period, declassified and studied extensively by military historians in the decades since, show something that surprised even the officers compiling them at the time. Combat exhaustion casualty rates during the Bulge, while significant, were lower than models predicted given the severity of conditions. Multiple after-action assessments pointed to the same contributing factor. Even in the worst sectors, mail delivery and unit rotation through rear area rest facilities the USO had built, staffed, and supplied, continued in some form almost throughout the battle, even when ammunition and fuel deliveries were disrupted by the same weather and the same German offensive. This was not an accident of priority. It reflected a doctrinal decision made years earlier in planning rooms far from any battlefield, that morale support was not the last thing to be funded when resources were scarce. It was treated as essential infrastructure, the same category as ammunition resupply, precisely because military psychiatrists and planners had concluded, based on First World War data and ongoing research, that a unit's combat effectiveness depended as much on its men's psychological reserves as on their physical supplies. German forces during the same battle had no equivalent system functioning at any meaningful scale. Feldpost delivery to forward units during the Ardennes offensive was almost non-existent, both because of the speed and chaos of the German advance, and because, even when the army was advancing rather than retreating, the infrastructure to prioritize mail delivery under combat conditions simply did not exist at the scale the Americans had built. German soldiers captured during and after the battle frequently told interrogators they had received no mail in weeks, sometimes months, and had no organized recreational or psychological support structure behind the lines comparable to what they observed, with evident confusion, among captured American materials and prisoners. Hans Brandt's note about American mail was, in this sense, a small fragment of a much larger pattern that German intelligence kept encountering and never quite knew how to categorize, because it did not fit into any framework for understanding military strength that German doctrine had developed. It was not a weapon. It produced no casualties. It could not be countered by armor or artillery. It was simply a sustained, deliberate, well-funded decision that the emotional well-being of an ordinary soldier was worth the same institutional investment as his rifle and his rations. The numbers, when historians later assembled them, are almost difficult to comprehend in scale. Over the course of the war, the V-mail system processed and transmitted more than 1.5 billion individual letters. The USO, across its wartime network of clubs, hosted an estimated 1 billion visits by American servicemen and women, a figure larger than the entire population of the United States at the time, reflecting how often individual soldiers returned to the same clubs again and again across years of deployment. Bob Hope alone performed for an estimated 10 million troops across his wartime touring career. But the institutional memory of the USO was never really about the famous names. It was about the unnamed volunteers, women mostly, working in church basements and Quonset huts on islands most Americans back home had never heard of, pouring coffee and writing letters for boys who couldn't see well enough, or whose hands shook too badly to write themselves. One of those volunteers, a woman named Eleanor Wishart, who ran a USO club near a staging area in southern England in the months before D-Day, kept a journal throughout the war that her family donated to a regional historical society decades after her death. In it, she described a recurring scene that she said she never grew used to, no matter how many times she watched it happen. A young soldier, sometimes only days from shipping out toward the invasion beaches, sitting at one of the club's writing tables for an hour or more, composing a letter to his mother or his sweetheart, then handing it to a volunteer to be mailed, and sitting there afterward, not leaving, not moving on to the dance floor or the coffee counter, just sitting for a long moment, as though the act of writing the letter had used something up that needed to be replaced before he could stand again. She wrote that she came to understand, over the months she ran that club, that what she was providing was not entertainment. It was a kind of maintenance. The same way a mechanic kept a Jeep's engine running, she was helping keep something in these young men running that the Army, in its wisdom, had recognized needed tending just as much as any engine did. Hans Brandt survived the war. He was captured during the collapse of the German position in the Ardennes in January 1945 and spent the remainder of the conflict in an American prisoner of war camp in Oklahoma, one of the hundreds of camps where German prisoners, as this channel has documented before, encountered an America that contradicted nearly everything they had been told to expect. He was repatriated in 1947 and returned to a small town outside Cologne, where he became a postal clerk, a quiet irony that he reportedly never commented on publicly, though a cousin who gave an interview decades later said Brandt kept, until his death in 1988, a single American V-mail letter that had been left behind, unclaimed, in the same ambushed mail column he had screened in December 1944. He had never been able to explain to his cousin why he'd kept it. He had simply never thrown it away. The USO did not close when the war ended. It is, in fact, still operating today, at military installations, in airports, anywhere American service members are stationed or in transit, run on the same founding premise established in February 1941, that the distance between a soldier and home is a problem that can and should be actively managed, not simply endured. V-mail was discontinued after the war, its purpose fulfilled, its technology obsolete almost as soon as peacetime cargo capacity made the original problem disappear. The forms themselves, small, fragile, faded, survive today mostly in attics and shoeboxes, in the same drawers where families kept dog tags and photographs and the other small relics of men who came home. And the smaller number of relics, belonging to men who did not. Read enough of them in the archives that have preserved them, and the pattern Hans Brandt noticed in December 1944 becomes impossible to miss. They are not dramatic letters. They rarely mention the war directly. They ask about the weather back home. They ask if the dog is doing all right. They say, in 100 different small ways, the same essential sentence: I am still here, and I am still thinking about you. And that has to be enough for now. It was enough. That was, in the end, the entire point of the system. Not to win the war through sentiment, to keep millions of ordinary men functional long enough to win it through everything else: the artillery, the supply chains, the doctrine of initiative this channel has traced across a dozen other stories. By ensuring that the men operating all of it never forgot, even in the worst nights of the worst winter of the war, that somewhere behind them, someone was still writing their name on an envelope. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. That is over 13 minutes of real history, and it means something that you are still here. If this reached you, if the soldiers who lived for mail call, and the volunteers who poured coffee in church basements on the other side of the world deserve to be remembered, hit the like button. It is the single most effective thing you can do to help this story find the people who care about it. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit subscribe and the bell, and you will not miss the next one. I would love to know where you are watching from today. Leave it in the comments. And if your family ever kept a letter from the war, a V-mail, a Feldpost, anything that survived, tell us about it. These stories survive because people like you keep passing them forward. Thank you.